Retro.
Are you an aspiring Jedi, or do you dabble with the dark side of the Force?
Regardless of whether you fancy yourself a defender of the light or an aspiring Sith Lord, you're going to need a lightsaber.
Podcast Stardust is pleased to partner with Saber Masters, the creators of high-quality, durable, and affordable lightsabers.
Saber Masters is preparing to launch the Ultimate Lightsaber 2.0, and right now you can get 2 for the price of 1.
So, check out the link in our show notes and go get your ultimate lightsabers from Saber Masters.
And don't forget to use our referral code Stardust to save $10 at checkout.
And each purchase using our referral code helps support Podcast Stardust.
Hello there. This is James Arnold Taylor, the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and whenever I'm in this part of the galaxy, I listen to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. Makes flying a little more tolerable. Don't tell Anakin.
Hello and welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithling.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And we got a hankering to talk about some Mandalorians and Sith and bears. Oh my. No bears. In this episode, but before, we're doing it because we felt like it when it came down to it. And,
Yeah.
So before we get into that, Jay, just want to remind everybody where we can be found around the internet.
Absolutely. And no communications jammed here. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The digital line, the signal is boosted to maximum output. The shield is down. We are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So we're going to be talking about episodes 14 through 16 of season 5 of the Clone Wars. And Jay, it occurred to me, like, we've talked about a significant portion of this season, not like chronologically or not sequentially or anything, but in our Hondo Hanaka series and talking about Ahsoka when we were doing the lead up to Ahsoka. We talked about the last couple episodes. We may just have to finish off this season at some point.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Just
we're
for this-
both completists in that regard. And it's just, season 5 is just a treasure trove of amazing Star Wars storytelling. So, I mean, it's easy to want to do that. And yeah, I think we're going to have to.
Yeah, it may be the only way I ever watch the D Squad episodes again, because that's there in season 5. But yeah, I needed something on in the background while I was cooking last weekend, and I'd watched all the Star Wars movies recently this year. I'd had them on, just been cycling through them, and then it brought the Clone Wars, and I was like, well, I don't want to start with the episode 1 because that's what I always do, and then somewhere around season 3, I like stop with that watch through, and then I start over again. So I went into season 5 and I picked up from where we had left off and started watching this story arc. And I guess we should fill everybody in what the story arc is if they aren't already familiar with it. But this is when Maul and Savage Opress end up teaming up with Pre Vizsla and Death Watch, and they effectively take over Mandalore. And it's a 3-story arc that has huge developments for the Clone Wars. Of course, at the time, we didn't know season 5 was going to be the last season of the Clone Wars before they ended up bringing it back for Netflix and later season 7 for Disney Plus. But it got rid of some characters, really pushed some things forward. There's some really fantastic moments in here. And when I saw this, I was like, Jay and I have to talk about these episodes on the show because they're just that good.
They really are. And not just that they set up things for Clone Wars, but now after having rewatched them again, I can see where the threads have, or the tendrils, have kind of spread out into a lot of other areas of Star Wars storytelling too. I mean, even with the live action series and everything, of course, with the Darksaber and the lore there. But I mean, yeah, this one's got it all. It's got Maul, which of course, I love me some Maul. And then we've got the Mandalorians, which hello. And then we've got Obi-Wan and Satine. Swoon. So, I mean, it's got everything. And yeah, I'm so thankful that you suggested this because it was quite a ride. It wrecks me every time too.
Yeah. And this story arc is devoid of any Jedi until we get to the third episode of it.
Right.
And so it really does rely on Mandalorian characters and Sith wannabes.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what they are,
Yeah.
for the most part. But okay, let's get into it. We're going to go episode by episode, but we will inevitably end up drifting across the 3 episodes as part of discussion, and it will be a full spoiler discussion. So if you want to go watch these first and then come back for our discussion, hit pause now. But I hope we've intrigued you. So with that said, Jay, you want to go ahead and give us the summary for episode 14, Eminence?
Absolutely. So Maul and Savage Opress are rescued by Death Watch and repaired. The would-be Sith and Death Watch, under the leadership of Pre Vizsla, form an uneasy alliance. From there, they build an army of criminals consisting of the Black Sun Cartel and the Pike Syndicate. This new criminal army then attacks the Hutts on Nal Hutta and finally Jabba's palace before the Hutts agree to join their ranks. As the episode ends, Maul is contemplating a plan whereby Pre Vizsla and Death Watch rule Mandalore, and Maul is the head of the galaxy's underworld.
What I loved about my rewatch this was just taking in how much Maul and Savage on one side and Pre Vizsla and Bo-Katan and the Death Watch on the other he's like, how fortunate we found someone that we can ally with to achieve our goals and then get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely an alliance of opportunity.
Oh yeah, yeah, and looking at that as a disposable alliance that has more far-reaching implications for later on. And Darth Maul really is kind of taking a page out of Palpatine's book in that way, because he sees the long game in that,
Mm-hmm.
at least what he wants to be the long game. And and of course we know eventually he does end up founding Crimson Dawn. So I mean there is that comes out of this too, which is just, yeah, that's what I'm saying, like, of all the little tendrils that we see
Yeah.
going out into the different aspects of Star Wars. It's just, yeah, it's insane.
Right. And then of course this episode is actually a sequel to the season premiere where Savage and Maul had ended up on Florum, entangled with Hondo Anaka and his pirates before
Right.
Obi-Wan and Stasali, I think it was, showed
Hmm.
up there. And Stas did not survive, but they did drive Maul and Savage Opress off the planet, and Hondo had to reclaim his pirates. That was so much fun. I love that episode. And we talked about that
Absolutely.
a couple months ago. So if you want to go
Hmm.
back, I'll try to put a link to that in the show notes. And then, we get Pre Vizsla back. So we haven't seen him in a while either here. And he's the leader of Death Watch, which again comes up, to your point, tentacles that show up elsewhere, the Mandalorian.
Right.
That is the sect of the Mandalorians that Din Djarin belongs to.
Hmm. Yep. And a very young and very angry Bo-Katan in this
Mm-hmm.
one. You could just see the difference even just in her facial expressions from this to, eventually going forward too, and to see kind of the origin story, if you will.
Yeah. I did not remember that at the beginning of this story arc, it was unknown to the audience that Bo-Katan and Satine were sisters.
Hmm.
I was like, huh. I thought that was something, and maybe just because of the distance from this, because this was out, like 12 years ago or
Right.
so, that, we just take it for granted that that's something we knew. I didn't realize it was a revelation that actually comes in the third episode of this arc.
I actually do remember watching that for the first time and thinking, "Oh my gosh,"
Mhm.
like that's a big thing right there, and what a cool reveal, and how all those things are interlocked and interconnected.
Right. So again, this episode is primarily focused on the building of the underworld army. And the first thing they do is they head off to Mustafar, of all places, to take over Black Sun. So this is such a cool Legends tie-in here, because the Black Sun were introduced in Shadows of the Empire, which was that multimedia event that came in the 90s that is the connective piece that attaches The Empire Strikes Back to Return of the Jedi, introduced Prince Zizor, who was a Faline. We got Dash Rendar in that, and his really cool ship that was kind of supposed to be like a rival to the Millennium
Mhm.
Falcon.
Right?
And that's where the Black Sun, this criminal organization, came from. But setting them up on Mustafar was an interesting idea. What do you think about that?
Yeah, because of course we know Mustafar from, where Darth Vader slash Anakin ends
Mm-hmm.
up. But yeah, it was great to see Black Sun, and it's funny that you mentioned Dash Rendar too, because I actually have his ship model somewhere in my basement.
Huh.
So, yeah, so there is that.
The
It's
Outrider?
probably worth something. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, and so Black Sun tries to stand up to him, and that's when Savage pulls out his double-bladed lightsaber and throws it down the table and decapitates every single one of the lieutenants and the leader of Black Sun in one fell stroke, leaving one guy who kind of takes us all in. And I think he says something along the like, after careful consideration,
Yeah.
we have reconsidered and will accept your offer to join.
Yeah, it's like, what's this we stuff at this point? It's just you, dude, making
Yeah.
the making the executive decision. So, yeah, two observations real quick before we move on. So, I
Mhm.
just absolutely love how when Maul and Savage finally kind of come to after being unconscious, and then of course Maul comes consciousness first, and then Savage eventually comes out of his little state, and he starts throwing around all the droids, which is very akin, to Darth Vader. But then when he stands up and he hits his head on the light, and it just kind of like wobbles a little bit, and then they introduce themselves and Maul says, "I am Maul and this is Savage." And it's like, okay. But my second observation is, once again, we've talked about this countless number of times, where the Clone Wars is very brutal. It is a kids show, but it's definitely not in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
And not just because of the violence, but also even just because of the dialogue. I was watching this with the closed captioning on, and just some of the things that were being said from a political standpoint, from a maneuverability standpoint, with Maul and Savage, and Death Watch, and how they were kind of putting all those pieces of the playing pieces on the board, kind of thing. And so it's very deep.
Yeah. The other thing is, once Maul gets his legs repaired, he no longer has like the spider legs.
Yeah,
They're regular humanoid legs, and he's no longer as tall as he was, because he was kind of like almost of a height with Savage Opress. And now he like comes up to Savage's shoulder
right.
with
Yeah,
like new
and
legs.
he's walking down the one area with Pre Vizsla, and they're the same height. I noticed that.
Yeah. So after conquering Black Sun, they go back to their base, or Death Watch's base on Zambar, and the Pike Syndicate arrives, and they basically say, "Yeah, the underworld is a small world, and we heard about what you're doing. We're here to join up," which was probably the smartest decision they could make, right
Mhm.
there, rather than risk getting attacked by Maul and a group of Mandalorians.
Right. Yep. And minimal loss of any kind of life. So I don't think they lost anybody in that deal.
Nope.
And it makes sense because the Pikes, we know them very well from their spice running. And so expanding the underworld is an ability for them to also expand their profits.
Yeah. Speaking of the spice running, this was a cool little trivia fact I found from the episode guide on StarWars.com. If you look at their mouths and their armor around their mouths and stuff like that, it's all stained red. And so are like their hands from using spice.
Oh, wow. I'll have to pay
Yeah,
more attention to that.
that was a cool little detail that I found.
Hmm.
So, following this, the last element that Maul wants to acquire is the Hutts. And so they go to Nal Hutta and basically make a demand that they join them or die. And the Hutts initially laugh this off, and then there's a little bit of an ambush. They'd hired bounty hunters, which we are familiar with. Sugi, Embo, Latsarazi, and Dengar all show up to
Yes.
try and fight off Maul and these Mandalorians. It does not go so well, and the Hutts are defeated there. All but one of them escape. That's Aruba the Hutt, and he basically is forced to tell them that they all fled to Jabba's palace on Tatooine, and then he gets killed. But I love Maul's line. It's like, so basically, what you can tell me is that I can find Jabba the Hutt in Jabba's palace on Tatooine. It's just like the disappointment and just the duh dripping out of Maul's mouth when he
Exactly.
says that is so fantastic.
But that's another thing I absolutely love about the Clone Wars, and just, a lot of the Star Wars in general. And Sam Witwer just brings that kind of, witty sort of comedy, but yet not comedy to the table. And like you said, it's something that we can snicker at, but
Mhm.
yet it's just so good. So good.
Right. And so that brings us to really the end of this episode. And, Maul kind of describes the plan, which is that they're going to go take control of Mandalore, and Pre Vizsla and Death Watch will rule Mandalore. And then he's going to build this galactic underworld. And the whole point is, as we kind of find out over the course of this trilogy, is that he wants to amass an army of sorts, or at least power, but he doesn't want to attract the attention of the Jedi.
Mhm.
And especially if you look at some of the videos that they did when all the Clone Wars was coming to DVD, and these are all available on the episode guides at StarWars.com. Both Dave Filoni and Sam Witwer talk about this quite a bit, that Maul learned how to be a Sith really, really well. When we saw him in The Phantom Menace, he was just Sidious's attack dog. But no, he understands about how to acquire power, how to organize power, how to take advantage of situations. And he couldn't just put together an army because the Jedi would come squash him,
Mhm.
or
Yes,
Sidious
and
would come squash him. And so he does it
definitely.
this way.
And that's what I was meaning about, him taking that page from Palpatine and
Mhm.
playing that long game. And not only that, but he even just kind of jumping ahead, as you said, will kind of float across these episodes when he's pleading with Sidious towards the end of the last episode. And he said, I used your teachings, like
Mhm.
because or Sidious is like, you survived. And he's like, I've used your teaching. So not only I think from the aspect of just being a Sith in general, but perhaps just from observing all of the things that Palpatine did and internalizing his end game, and then that was the thing that drove him forward. And maybe there's some other things in there too, with Palpatine in terms of, using the Force. But at any rate, getting back to the whole idea of why Pre Vizsla wanted to do this is, as we spring forward, we note that Satine is a pacifist, and so she's basically rearranged all of Mandalore to be this neutral pacifist kind of society, and has exiled all of these warriors to Concordia, the moon. And so, of course, Pre Vizsla and Death Watch do not like that, and that's the whole reason why they want to reclaim Mandalore.
Mhm. Okay. Well, let's get into the next episode, episode 15, which is Shades of Reason. So how about the summary for that one?
You got it. Maul and Pre Vizsla put their plans into action and launch a terrorist attack on Sundari, the capital city of Mandalore. Black Sun, the Pike Syndicate, and Hutt soldiers raid the docks, parks, and bank of the city, but they are eventually subdued by Death Watch. This was a ruse designed to displace Duchess Satine, and Pre Vizsla declares himself the new prime minister. He then turns on Maul and has him arrested. Maul had anticipated such treachery and challenged Pre Vizsla to a duel. Once victorious, Maul declares himself the new leader of Death Watch and reinstates former Prime Minister Almec as his puppet ruler of Mandalore.
Yeah, this is another fantastic episode, and this is where we really get to see Maul's political cunning at work
Hmm.
here. And I love it after they show up and they create all this discord and panic in the streets as Black Sun is like dramatically like attacking the docks and like, you are all now our slaves. I guess that actually may have been the park. And they're very dramatic. And then Death Watch will swoop in and say like superhero things like never fear.
Death Watch is here. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they take care of it. And as Satine is attempting to calm everybody down, Pre Vizsla shows up and calls her out and is it's like you're responsible for this, your pacifist notions allowed this to happen, but I will make us safe. And then the people start chanting his name. So it's really a cool episode. But then once they've got the desired result, they've got the favor of the people, and they put Satine in prison, but they just tell everyone that she ran off. And that's when they turn on Maul, and he ends up in the prison. And he's like, "Yeah, I anticipated this," and he's unwittingly put me exactly where I need to be so that I can find his
Hmm.
replacement, because it was a prison full of political prisoners,
Right.
and including Almec, the former prime minister. When we last saw him, Satine and Padme were undermining his plot to like use the black market to get rich, and it was
Right.
like end up poisoning the kids and the populace of Mandalore.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that was such an amazing whole like ruse and plan on Darth Maul's part, especially going back and really thinking about and analyzing and pulling this apart. It's like, man, he is just wicked smart. And he always has. I mean, I've always thought that he was, and
Mhm.
he doesn't get enough credit for that. And obviously, Pre Vizsla has completely underestimated the abilities of both Maul and Savage, both in muscle and in mind. And so, yeah, and obviously that all comes to a head. But, it got me to thinking about, because at first I thought, gosh, these people are so wishy-washy in terms of their loyalty to Duchess Satine and the whole idea of the pacifist lifestyle. But then I thought, okay, well, this is just a perfect illustration of like Maslow's hierarchy, where, your basic needs, food and water, and then your next basic need is safety.
Mhm.
So you cannot progress to anything else, such as social skills or self-actualization, unless you have that safety. And so, he preyed upon that, Maul did, and his psychology of just understanding how people would react to different things. And I have to say too that when Satine and Almec were having their conversation in the prison, and Satine was saying, about hope, and Almec was like, "Oh yeah, where's your hope now?" And she had this amazing line, and then Almec comes back and says something else to her too. And again, that was, and I wanted to write it down and I didn't. I wish I would have. But that's just part and parcel of, how high level the discourse is in this
Mhm.
this series, which is amazing.
Yeah, no, it's really quite fantastic, and even just the way Maul talks, because he's in there and he's telling Savage Opress about how, "No, I anticipated this. This is, I knew this treachery would come, but everything's fine." And then he just says to Savage, "I wish to tour this facility," as
Yeah,
opposed to "break
right.
us out of here."
Yeah.
And then Savage, unleashes that blast of the Force and busts open their cell, and they get out that way. So, it, like I said, it just impressed upon me, this story arc did, about the perception of Maul is just so different than
It
when we
is.
just had the Phantom Menace,
Mhm.
because he had what, like 23 words of dialogue in that movie. At last, we shall reveal ourselves as the Jedi. At last, we shall have
Yes,
our
we
revenge,
live
and
for
you know,
revenge.
yes, master, or was the other line, or whatever the situation may be, and
Mhm.
and then he was just always fighting and attacking people and stalking
Mhm.
around looking menacing, and now here he is, like chatty catty,
Right.
fucking things
And
up.
he
So,
wasn't a grunt,
mhm,
anymore, and I don't think he ever was, and that's why I say he's just so wicked smart, but
mhm,
it's not in a way that, "Yes, I anticipated this," that, "Oh gosh, yeah, I meant to do that," kind of a
mhm,
thing. You knew just from the way he was speaking that this was his plan all along. So,
mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, and it allows him to remain hidden as opposed to being upfront about
sure.
this, and it's very clever. Because something similar happens in the Darth Vader comic, and this was the first volume of it that got written, and Darth Vader puts together his own private army under Sidious's nose.
Mhm.
And it's a very similar thing. He took the lessons that Sidious had taught him about accumulating and acquiring power and having that secret reserve and put it into place. Now, eventually, Sidious discovered this and just went up to Vader and was like, "I'm really proud of you.
Mhm.
I'm pleased with you. This is exactly what a Sith is supposed to do. Maybe be a little bit more circumspect about it in the future, a little more discreet.
Right?
But this is exactly what you were supposed to have done, and because there was some doubt about Vader's abilities as a potential Sith at the time. So anyway, getting back to this, once Maul has selected Almec as the puppet that he'll put in place to run Mandalore, he goes to the throne room and challenges Pre Vizsla because he knows this code of honor, and he's very wise in saying this. He's a warrior, and warriors live by a code. And if I challenge him in front of all of his men, he'll have no choice but to accept, which is exactly what happens. And so you got Pre Vizsla using the dark saber and Maul using a red lightsaber, and they just go at it. Vizsla keeps pulling out all the Mandalorian tricks from the armor, and eventually Maul subdues him and
Yeah.
takes the dark saber from him and lops off his head, declares himself the new leader of Death Watch. So
Mhm.
that fight was just incredible. It was one of the better ones we'd seen in Clone Wars at that point.
Oh yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite encounters in all of Star Wars, and I've written about this, blogged about this so many times. And again, it just shows Maul's intelligence when it comes to understanding culture
Mhm.
and just not taking things at face value and understanding what is the meaning behind what he's about to do when he challenges Pre Vizsla. And I just think that it's so ironic that as they are fighting, there's that portrait of Satine in the background on the wall, and
Mhm.
that is, like, featured several times, and you can see there's one at one point where you can see Maul's head and whole, like, upper part of his torso completely perfectly framed, centered in front of that portrait, and it's just such a prophetic kind of thing to show the image of pacifism being challenged by the image of terrorism, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And it's like, ugh, it gets me every time. And that's the one that, eventually Maul has that
Mhm.
he has that portrait.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And did you notice they were very careful with the way they showed Maul decapitating Pre Vizsla?
Mhm.
As the blow comes down, Vizsla's shoulders, head area is completely hidden by someone standing in front of that
Right.
view. And then they do an overhead shot, and Vizsla's body is lying there, but you never see his head anywhere. It
Right.
should be right there within that shot, but they
Mhm.
carefully removed it because they thought it was a little too graphic. And
Exactly.
similarly, back in the prior episode, when all those members of Black Sun had their heads removed, and that was the implication. You could infer that from what happened, but you never saw any heads fall off
Mhm. That's so
there.
true. That's so true. Yeah, the it's like the camera panned
Mhm.
behind that one Mandalorian, and I wanna say it wasn't Bo-Katan, but it was someone that obviously that was witnessing it. Although I have to say, I think because there was another beheading scene that sticks out in my head from the Clone Wars, and that is when Ahsoka basically beheads, like, 7 Mandalorians at once, and I
Mhm.
do think that you see but again, it's their heads are in their buckets, so it's a
Right.
little different than the actual, like, noggin itself, if you will. There's a
Well,
lot
and
of
then
beheadings in Clone Wars.
going back to Attack of the Clones, when Jango Fett gets beheaded by Mace Windu.
Mhm.
Now, see, that was a PG-13 movie.
Right.
And so, the helmet goes flying off, and you can see a shadow of a head falling out of it, but you never see that itself happen
Mhm. And
on
then we've
screen.
also got Dooku.
You're right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's a number of these type of things happen, but they're very careful about doing it so they don't get that R rating, when
Right.
it comes down to it. Okay, well, enough about beheadings. Uh,
Oh, but it's so much fun.
indeed. It's not the French Revolution, but, anyway, Maul declares himself the leader of Death Watch and Mandalore is his. A number of Mandalorians bend the knee to him, except Bo-Katan and what we'll come to know as the Night Owls. She says never, an outsider will never rule Mandalore, and she calls the rest of them traitors for giving in to Maul. And then civil war breaks out there, essentially, when it comes down to it. She more in the next episode, but she starts throwing bombs, they start blasting at each other, and eventually she and her allies escape. And that's where that scene ends. But as you were talking about earlier, this really foreshadows the Bo-Katan will come to know in The Mandalorian and The Mandalorian later.
Mhm. And did you at any point in time wonder if Pre Vizsla had an issue with the weight of the dark saber? Because that's come up a couple of times since, and I don't know if
Hmm.
at the time that was something that was even thought about by Dave Filoni at all, but, and looking back on it, he does seem to tire. And after wielding it so often, and of course, the fight in and of itself was very tiring, and then he was resorting to all kinds of other things like, basically like ninja stars and bombs and his jetpack and. But I thought about that as I was watching it.
With that in mind, I'd have to watch the scene again.
Mhm.
There's a stark contrast between how he wielded it and how Din Djarin wielded it, which was
Mhm.
Din couldn't get very far at all with that. I mean, he
Right.
ended up slicing his own leg trying to use it, and Pre Vizsla didn't have that type of difficulty. relying solely on my memory of this, I feel like he just got outclassed by Maul.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know, a trained Sith apprentice using a lightsaber versus a guy who has used swords but never really had the training to use anything like that.
Mhm. Oh, yeah,
So,
and again, he just completely underestimated Maul, and even, I was thinking about that when they were doing the whole ruse and Pre Vizsla was fighting with Opress, like, Opress was just obviously toying with him because he knew he had to at that point, like, he could have
mhm.
easily taken him out, and I don't think that Pre Vizsla even realized that, like, I think he was thinking that, he was giving him a little bit of a fight there, but he really wasn't.
No, no, that was you could almost see how irritated Savage was that he had to go through
Yes.
with this.
Mhm.
All right, well, this episode ends with Olmec addressing the people, making the absurd claim that Satine murdered Pre Vizsla, and that he is the new acting prime minister. Okay, that gets
Yeah.
into the us to episode 16, the last one of this arc, which is called The Loss. And I forgot to write a summary. So essentially, what it comes down to is Satine gets rescued by her nephew Corky and his friends, along with Bo-Katan. Before they can get away, the Mandalorian commandos, catch up to them and they capture her, but she manages to get a message off to Obi-Wan Kenobi asking for help. The Jedi refuse to intervene because it's a neutral world and there's no evidence of separatist involvement. Obi-Wan goes along anyway to Mandalore, rescues Satine from her cell, only for them to get caught again by Maul and some Mandalorians. Maul then murders Satine right in front of Obi-Wan Kenobi with the goal of making him suffer and embrace his anger and hate, which he does not do. But then he is aided in his escape by Bo-Katan, and this is when it's revealed that she is in fact Satine's sister. And Obi-Wan leaves basically telling Bo-Katan this is going to end up with a Republic invasion of Mandalore, which Bo-Katan is in favor of. So there we go. We get a little bit of a summary,
Nice
maybe a
job.
little bit incomplete, but we will get into some details as we go here. Very first thing we see in this episode is we get a little card at the beginning that says in memory of Ian Abercrombie. So he was the actor that had been doing the voice of Chancellor Palpatine and Darth Sidious throughout the series, and he passed away on January 26, 2012. So this is one of his last performances in that role in the Clone Wars.
Wow, yes, yes, and it's a nice tribute that they did that at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. So I like this episode a lot, but it is just kind of the futility of escape attempts going on here. I mean, there's some tragic things that happen here, but Satine escapes and gets captured. Obi-Wan shows up, helps Satine escape. She gets captured, and then she doesn't get a third attempt in this. And then um, I don't know. What do you think about that aspect of this episode?
Well, I think it was a necessary aspect because it had to set up the idea of Obi-Wan coming to her rescue, and eventually that was her last resort,
Mm-hmm.
in that, she wanted to try to do everything that she possibly could to take care of herself, but in the end, it had to be her love that came to try to do that, and unfortunately, in that, she set him up for, Maul, and she had no idea, what was going on, and I wonder if she and Obi-Wan ever talked about his experiences with Maul. I have a feeling that they didn't, just because of the fact that Satine seemed to not really know who Maul was or his significance to Obi-Wan, because I
Mm-hmm.
think if she would have known that, she never would have reached out to him and for help. You know what I mean? Like she may have reached out to someone else and left Obi-Wan out of it. So, with that regard, I think that needed to set up that whole idea that, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope," kind of thing,
Sure.
which is very similar. The the
Yeah,
feel of that
it
was very
was.
similar, the holograph and everything. But I have to say it cracked me up because, the first thing you have in our notes is Satina's rescued Corky, her nephew. But is he her nephew? Really? Or is he their love child? There's a lot of
Okay.
discourse out there
I
about
had
that.
never thought about that
Have you
before.
never heard of that fan theory? Wow. You know
No,
where my head is.
I just don't know what other sibling Satine has, though. So
Exactly. It's
Ma-
very, convenient.
interesting, interesting. Yeah, of course, when the Force Awakens and Last Jedi and all those movies are coming out, and there was all these questions about who is Rey, since she didn't have a last name. There was lots of speculation that could have been Obi-Wan Kenobi's daughter, and
Mhm.
potentially that was his and Satine's daughter, was one of the theories that I'd heard out there.
Mhm.
I never really heard of this notion with Corky. I would have to sit there and think about it. I mean, because I don't even know exactly when the whole backstory of Satine and Obi-Wan happened.
I
That,
do.
when they were, well, okay, well, I don't want, that's an entire episode unto itself. So
Yes, it
let's
is.
kind of stick a pin in that. Maybe we'll bring it up another day.
Oh,
But
yeah, I could go down a rabbit hole on that
yeah,
one for sure.
they keep threatening to give us details about that, and they don't. So,
Mhm.
but anyway, so like I said, they make this brief escape, and then she gets captured again, but not before she could send out this message. Okay, we get to the Jedi Temple, and Yoda and Ki-Adi-Mundi share Satine's message with Obi-Wan, where she's asking for help. And Obi-Wan wants to do something. And Ki-Adi-Mundi and Yoda say, we can't. This is an internal matter for the Mandalorians. There's no evidence of separatist involvement. The Senate won't approve. This is perhaps some of the most disappointed I've ever been with the Jedi Order, I think.
Mhm.
And I think it's a thing that we are getting right now in the High Republic, even, whereas that, well, when did you become just a tool of the Republic as
Right.
opposed to servants of the Force here?
Exactly. Yep, and I think that a lot of it comes down to the fact that when the Clone Wars started,
Mhm.
there was a shift in paradigm big time between what the Jedi felt was their role, and because we've heard them talk, even Mace Windu said, "We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers," but there's a lot of political machinations in there too, and I think that the Jedi have always had that political aspect. I mean, again, all the way back to the High Republic, as we're seeing, there's a lot of puzzle pieces that are in place between the Jedi and the Republic, and what's going on and how they are being used as a tool. And it's not so much for light and life anymore as it is for what is best for the politics and
Mhm.
supporting the Jedi Order, because without those politics, the Jedi Order has no support. Because I often wonder, where the heck do they get their funding?
Right. But if their focus is the will of the Force, is any of that support necessary?
Mhm,
No, it's not. They can carry out that mantra. They can train Jedi without having to have any support from the Republic whatsoever. They can
mhm,
do what the will of the Force is without having that financial burden on their
mhm,
shoulders.
mhm.
So, anyways, that's what I was getting with this thing. It's just it is there. This is just some evidence of how they lost their way, I think, in all this,
Right.
and
No, I agree.
that's part of Sidious's grand design, was to draw the Jedi into this war, make them lose their connection to the Force, so to speak, or lessen it anyway, and get them whittled down through a protracted war, get loyalty built up for the Chancellor, and then wipe the Jedi out. And it was a masterful plan. And so, but we just kind of see this is a step towards that direction, when it comes
Right,
down to it. So,
right. So true.
well, Maul learns a Satine message. He's very happy to hear this, and he wisely tells Almec to keep Mandalore rather neutral, because if, as long as Mandalore is neutral, he understands exactly what's going to happen. The Jedi won't intervene in force. That it will just be Obi-Wan who comes, and that's all they want. And
Mhm.
that's, Maul is sticking to Sith ideology, which is keep their existence a secret, stay in the background. They are the Phantom Menace that's out there from the first
Right,
movie, and strike from the shadows. And so that's the
right.
whole plan. And that he knows Obi-Wan will come because of his attachment to Satine, and that's what he wanted all along. So it's I just can't get over how well this story arc, these 3 episodes were written, and this plays right into it.
The only thing that I don't understand, though, and I thought about this while watching this, is how did Maul know of Obi-Wan and Satine's relationship to know that he would be the one that she would contact?
I don't know that he necessarily did, except for he knew. Okay, let me rephrase that. I don't know that he necessarily knew she would. She just knew he did,
Mhm,
and that Obi-Wan was the type of person that was going to respond to that.
mhm, mhm. Okay, I
Yeah.
can see that.
So Obi-Wan gets to Mandalore, the capital city of Sundari, and he's in his Reiko Hardeen disguise. I thought that was a nice touch.
I love that, and I have to just say real quick, like, why did he even keep that? He put that in his Jedi closet thinking, "Oh, maybe I'll need this again someday."
Yeah,
It just
I don't
cracks me
know.
up.
It's
Anyway.
but he's got Anakin's ship, the Twilight,
Yeah.
which we hadn't seen in quite some time either. And of course, this
Oh,
is
the clunker.
the last time we get to see the Twilight because it does not survive this episode. It gets blasted
Right.
apart. I wonder what
Rip.
Anakin thought about that. Did we ever get a conversation between those
I
two about
know.
this?
You know what? It's funny that you say that because when it did blow up, I was like, Anakin's not gonna be really happy with that. I mean, even though it was a clunker of a ship, and even Obi-Wan says, "This is the last time I borrow a ship from Anakin," and it's
Mhm.
like he has to beat on it and get his foot to like get the landing thing to come down and everything. But yeah, I thought about the exact same thing. Like Anakin was probably like, Obi-Wan, what'd you
Mhm.
do? That was my fix it ship. That was my tinker ship. What'd you do to it?
Yeah. So Bo-Katan's keeping an eye on him. He gets to the prison and breaks Satine out. And again, we've already talked about this. It's a very short-lived escape before they're captured again. And the Twilight blows up and they're on that landing pad and Satine's kind of unconscious and Obi-Wan looks up and he's like, no, it can't be, as he sees Maul come striding towards him. And then, you know, Savage Opress is like, this is when we kill him. Is like, nope, throw him in the prison. And eventually they bring Obi-Wan up to the throne room so that Maul can inflict the cruelest revenge. And he
Yeah.
starts off by force choking Satine, pulls out the dark saber, and then runs her through with it. And then she dies in Obi-Wan's arms.
Yeah, and that whole encounter too. I mean, even though Obi-Wan was facing all of this in front of him, that he said, "I've seen your village. I know where you come from," as he's addressing Maul.
Mm.
"I know you didn't choose this life. The Night Sisters made you do it." I mean, here's just classic Obi-Wan, trying to see the good in someone, trying to bring them back to the light, trying to talk them off the ledge, kind of a thing. And Maul was that just fueled his fire just even
Hmm.
more.
Yeah, because when it wasn't getting through, Obi-Wan ends up resorting to some barbs as well, which is like, only the weak embrace the dark side.
Right, and then
Yeah,
that really threw him over the edge.
right.
But yeah, that scene breaks me every single time. "I love you, Obi-Wan. I always will." And then she
Hmm.
dies. Ugh, and
Yep.
the music, ugh. Yeah, I was literally weeping watching this again. And then I
Hmm.
loved how Savage is like, "Do we kill him now?" And
Yeah.
then Maul's like, "No." Like, dude, it's just I know you wanna kill him, but no.
How about now?
Right, "How about now?
Now?
No?"
What about now? So, yeah, Savage was all about that.
Mhm.
And so, anyways, he gets thrown into the prison only to be freed by Bo-Katan. And they start to flee. And at this point, there is a civil war breaking out across Mandalore. And this is where the episode gets kicked into high gear as Palpatine, from his office on Coruscant, senses something in the Force and requests his shuttle. And the next thing we see is Darth Sidious's arrival on Mandalore. It's the first time in the Clone Wars we've seen Sidious in the flesh.
Yeah.
And it's so amazing. He's just force choking Mandalorians that get in his way. And then we get to the throne room and Sidious or Maul at this point is like, I feel a presence that I haven't felt. And suddenly it hits him. It's
Mhm.
Sidious as he's
Yep.
walking into the chamber and he drops to one knee and he's like, Master. And, you talked about it a little bit earlier. Sidious says, I see you survived. I'm impressed with this. And Maul attempts to tell him, like, yes, I built this army to, so I could return to your side. And Sidious is like, well, how unfortunate is I can tell you're trying to deceive me. And that's when the fight starts. And it really rages. If the fight between Maul and Pre Vizsla was a 10, this is a 12.
Oh, yeah.
The three-way fight that we got going on here.
Oh, yeah, for sure, and just the fact that Sidious, took it upon himself to personally go out to Mandalore just speaks volumes. And,
Mhm.
that he was gonna put the kibosh on this, that there was not gonna be anybody that was gonna get in his way when it came to what he wanted to do. And, just talking to Maul in the way that, "You've been replaced and, you've deceived me." And Maul is just pleading. He's like, "Please, no, have mercy." And all I could think of was Darth Bane, "If those who ask for mercy do not deserve it." and
Mhm.
then the Force lightning comes, and then, of course, Opress is then killed, and then as he is dying, the green magic of the Night Sisters starts to leave his body, and the way that he was apologizing to Maul, like, "I wasn't strong enough, brother," it's just it was
Mhm.
again, like Obi-Wan said, Opress was also forced into this too. I mean, from his origins, we know that he was not a warrior. He was not prone to violence, and he was made to be that way. So it was very sad in that way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I I just couldn't get over this fight though. And the dialogue in here, I always get kind of annoyed, like in comic books, when you're seeing like the superhero, the supervillain fight, and they're having like these entire conversations while they're trading punches and blasting away each other. It's like that does not happen. It
With
just does
yeah,
not.
the
But
monologue.
they timed it really well here. Like there's these pauses where they, like some major blow gets landed, and while people are recovering, Sidious will say things like, there's, you know, first thing, above all with the Sith is that there can only be two, and you've been replaced. This line you were just talking about here, and Maul starts pleading for mercy. It's like, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. I've got other plans for you, and that comes in a comic that we previously talked about on this episode. I'll have to.
Mhm.
Wow, that was a long time ago.
It was a
Good,
long time
wow.
ago.
Yeah, I'll have to link to that one in the show notes as well,
Definitely.
because it explains what happens between this and season 7 of the Clone
Yes.
Wars and why Maul's back on Mandalore after all this. But to also touch on something you were talking about with Sidious dealing with this personally, he really didn't have any other choice. This is Sith business,
Mhm.
and Maul is a known Sith. Qui-Gon reported his encounter with him, and then Obi-Wan talked about encountering him. Maul's known to be out there, and Sidious is managing both sides of this war as Palpatine on behalf of the Republic on one side, and Sidious as leader of the Separatists on the other, in the shadows behind Count Dooku,
Right.
so to speak. But he can't. It's not in his interest to have Mandalore involved at this
Right.
point,
It
and
yeah.
so and then he's also got to deal with this because what does that say to Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, if Sidious has left a apprentice out there?
Mhm. Yeah, it
So,
makes him look weak too.
mhm, yeah.
Definitely.
So there's I don't know. It was. I remember the first time I saw this, I had no idea that was even coming, and I was just so completely
Right?
blown away by it. And it's one of these moments in Star Wars where you just have to sit down and watch every time it comes on screen.
Mhm. Mhm. Oh, I
Yeah,
know. I love it. It's so good.
yeah.
It's so good.
And then, of course, the thing that we kind of skipped over is when Obi-Wan Kenobi gets to that Mandalorian gauntlet and boards it. That's when he says he's going to go back to the Republic, and if he tells them about this, there's going to be an invasion. And Bo-Katan's like, "Yes, good, as long as Maul dies, that's what I want." And then, he's like, "Wait, you're Satine's sister. I'm so sorry." And there's just that kind of that look of regret that Satine has on her
Right.
face.
Right. Yeah, and that's I wonder when Obi-Wan actually came to that realization.
Hmm.
But I
Yeah.
love how they're running, for their lives basically, and Bo-Katan says, "Boy, Mom must really have it out for you," and Obi-Wan's like, "You have no idea.
He really must want you dead.
Want you dead." That's what it
Yes.
was. Yeah, "You have no idea." Again, just that well-placed humor just in those little places that just really, really put the icing on the cake for these episodes.
Yeah, and James Arnold Taylor's delivery as
Oh, for
Obi-Wan
sure.
there nailed it. So,
Flawless. Yep.
okay. Well, we've gone a bit long. Any final thoughts on this before we wrap it up?
Oh gosh, I mean, like I said, we could go into some major rabbit holes here, but I think we've done a really good job of covering these again. And again, thank you for suggesting this. I'm so thankful that we did it. I love it. Every time I watch it, I love it. I
Mhm.
actually sent a picture on Snapchat to my two boys and I said, "Look, this is my homework for the podcast." And Colby one gets back to me and goes, "I wish I had that kind of homework at college."
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, well, now that we said it, we're gonna have to finish off season 5, and then we'll
Yes,
pick
we are.
another season of the Clone Wars and go through that as well. It
Sounds
just
great.
feels like a requirement. And yeah, I just remember how excited you were when I suggested this
Yes,
a week
yes, yes,
ago.
please. Yes.
All right. Well, we hope everyone else enjoyed it as well, and go watch these episodes again. They're just so good.
They
And
are.
with that, thanks for joining us for this episode of Podcast Stardust and our discussion. And we'll definitely do some more Clone Wars soon. And if you want to make sure that you get those episodes, then make sure you hit the subscribe button for Podcast Stars on your podcast of your choice, whether it's called subscribe, follow, join, whatever. Hit the button, and you'll be able to get all these future episodes. We tend to come back to these things quite often. So I'd also like to remind you that you can find all of our episodes over on retrozap.com, all previous 713 of them. And RetroZap is also the home to a bunch of other great podcasts covering pretty much everything in geek culture, from superheroes to sci-fi, fantasy, horror movies. You got it. It's there, whether in podcast or article form. We always appreciate your 5-star rating and reviews on whatever podcatcher it is you use to catch your podcasts. And if you've got a moment, you can head over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating there, follow it up with a review. We greatly appreciate that. That's the number one driver in helping others notice the podcast and recommendations and the sort. And also, don't forget to share the show and your favorite episodes over on social media. So speaking of that, Jay, you want to remind everybody what those social media contacts are one more time?
Of course. So we are very easily found on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Podcast Stardust. And we do have a Pinterest page with a whole bunch of boards over there. And Dennis was alluding to our YouTube. We have 2 different YouTube outlets. So the regular YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So head over to both of those, like and subscribe. And then if you're up for that real-time chatter, we do have a Discord in the RetroZap Discord server. So our room is over there, and we are just one of a ton of different rooms. And especially with this particular episode, would love to hear some thoughts and some reactions and some memories, and anything that y'all can come up with. It's a fun place to talk things out. So the link for that is in our show notes. And then also in our show notes is the link to our TeePublic store, where you can pick up one of 7 different Podcast Stardust logo designs on everything from apparel to home goods and pretty much everything in between. And then we also have our partnership with Saber Masters still going on. So if you use our referral code Stardust at checkout, you can save yourself an extra $10. So head over there and check out all of the amazing lightsabers that they have for sale. They do have the 2-for-1 still going on with the Ultimate Lightsaber 2.0. So once again, make sure you put that Stardust code in, and it also helps out the show. So the link for that will be in our show notes, or you can just simply go to sabermasters.com. So with that, Dennis, I know Warp Trails is getting ready to hit things into high gear. So why don't you fill everybody in on that and anything else you got going on?
By the time this airs, if all has gone well, then Warp Trails will release its first episode in a couple months with the return of Discovery Season 5. Having happened last week, my wife and I will be breaking down those episodes again on Warp Trails, which is a RetroZap podcast feed exclusive. So what that means is if you want to catch the coverage, just go to your podcatcher of choice, look up the RetroZap feed, and you can find the episodes there. The other and probably even easier place to find all this is just to go to retrozap.com and find the Warp Trails page. It's easy enough to do under the podcast section. And you can find the upcoming episodes, all of our past episodes covering prior seasons of Discovery, Lower Decks, Strange New Worlds, and Picard. Jay, I know you are in the middle of Cosplay Mageddon. What is the latest going on there?
That is a perfect way to put it. So yes, I am 2 days out from going to Fan Expo Cleveland. So the con crunch is definitely real. Putting the finishing touches on my original concept Mandalorian that is based on Tahiri Vela. And I've got some really, really cool little details thrown in there from Tahiri's life in general. And I do have a Spotify playlist that is dedicated to Vela vibes that I'll make sure that I put into our story on Instagram. And then I'm also thinking about taking Fourth Sister actually to Cleveland because she's become more than relevant again. Not that she wasn't ever before, but seeing her in Tales of the Empire trailer has really pushed that into high gear again. And then you can always catch me as Ahsoka and Hera, 2 different versions of that. So I've got a couple appearances in April, and I'm already starting to work on my May calendar for appearances as well. So if you go to j.snipscosplay on Instagram, you can check out all the fun.
All right, upcoming on the show on Friday, we'll be discussing the latest episode of The Bad Batch. Then on Monday, it's time for a look at the week's Star Wars news. So, thanks for listening to episode 714 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.